So, good evening, morning, afternoon, and whatever other time thing you might be in. This is a this we are much earlier back than people would have expected. This is another episode of the Symposium Podcast. We've gathered a new the usual crowd really, but with a good sampling of the usual crowd to sit down and discuss things as intellectuals and not ramble about randomly. Totally not. Anyway, and to do this, I have gotten two very experienced writers. Some of them might be even award winning. I might have mentioned that before. And they're titans, if you will, of the industry. Let's say that. And it's Phil Bricado and it's Rachel, who are both awesome people, much cooler than I am. Welcome.
Oh,
Thank
thank you.
you.
So today, the topic, just so we can get things like starting with like a panache, a boom, if you will. We're talking. We are making an episode for you, the people. If you want to become a writer, you will learn everything you need to learn today, most likely. 5%. You will be given the intro guides, and really, this is people who will not take no for an answer. But when I in my youth 1 year ago, two maybe, went over to Phil and was like, "Hey, I want to learn from you. Mentor me. How do I become a writer? Should I be how? What's the best way?" And he's like, "No." That was
No.
his answer. Don't.
No, don't.
And I
Don't
mean,
do
so before we go into tips, Phil, could you elaborate on why you said that to me at the time?
Writing is tremendously hard way to make a living, or even a way to make money. The thing is it's also a lot of people have glamorous misconceptions about writing. As Harlan Ellison often said, anybody who's taken a English class thinks they can write, and they are wrong.
No, it's
Uh,
true.
and a lot of because especially over the last 30 years or so, the quality of education of how to use the language, and I can only say this about America because that's the only place I have experience with in terms of this, but the quality of education in America has dropped so precipitously that even the basic communication skills are not being taught anymore. And I've been finding this out with writers I've been working with who are very talented people, but who have not learned grammatical structure thing. And there's an important thing that's often overlooked about writing, specifically about writing, is that language is a collection of abstract symbols through which we communicate, or rather, a series of concrete symbols through which we communicate abstract ideas. In order to communicate those things, you need to use symbols that your audience will understand in a way that your audience will understand what you mean, as as accurately as you can use this incredibly imperfect medium. Um, there is no one true way of communicating these things, because the quote unquote official way, at least in the case of at least in the case of English and French, were established by a bunch of upper echelon academics trying to create a code through which only the right people could speak and be understood, and to push everyone who did not speak that way down into, oh, those people don't properly communicate. And of course, underclasses and subcultures also create our own methods of communication so that the other people can't understand what we're saying. Um, the one of the challenging things about writing is that you have to master a wide variety of communication modes in whatever language it is that you're working. You have to master a number of different communication codes and know your audience well enough, read your audience well enough to be able to communicate what you want to communicate in a way that they will ideally understand what you mean. That is more difficult than it sounds. Um, it's it's a kind of a concrete form of telepathy, and so where the terrain is constantly changing. Terminology that we used 15, 20, 30 years ago is not terminology we use now. A big part of being a writer involves listening to other people and watching how other people communicate both verbally and seeing with the internet, seeing the way that they communicate, that we communicate in words, and then constantly processing those changes of communication and paying attention to how different people communicate in different groups under different circumstances. Again, this is this is largely an invisible part of the art because it's not something people talk about. It's not something you'll hear about in an English class. And I think maybe I understand this one better than a lot of people who just go to English class because I was trained as a method actor. I'm on the autistic spectrum, and my ex-wife is a PR flack. So I've been spending personally and professionally, I've spent 40 years analyzing communication styles. Um, and the more I analyze those communication styles, the more I recognize how complex those things really are. And I can also see the artifice through which all of these things are built. Um, Most people don't have that background. Those things certainly aren't taught in classes. And these days, something I began to realize when I was teaching at the Art Institute of Seattle was that even the basic forms of even the basic forms of straightforward English grammar, American English grammar, punctuation, sentence structure, syntax, and so forth, are not being taught largely, and so a lot of people don't have even the basic tools to do an incredibly complex task. So it's easy to type words, as I believe it was Truman Capote said, that's not writing, that's just typing. It's easy to type words. It's easy to sit down at a desk and type out 10,000 words and put it on Amazon and Kindle, but that doesn't mean you actually know what you're doing. Uh, that said, there's another preconception that says that a writer is not a writer unless they are published or published professionally. That's not true. You're a writer if you write. You're a good writer if you work at your craft, and it is a craft. There's talent involved, but there's a lot of craft and a lot of skill involved in it. And like I said a few minutes ago, that skill set is constantly changing. But there is. So there's the talent, there's the talent, there's the skill, there's the craft. Um, but doing the thing, striving to do the thing, makes you good at it. Might not necessarily make you Sean Maguire or William Shakespeare, but it's doing the thing makes a person a writer. Not being published, not being paid for it, not how many books do you have on Amazon or how many books have publishers paid you for. There are definitely different levels of the craft, but doing the work is what determines whether or not a person is a writer.
And that's a very very insightful intro. It's hard to top that, but I think we'll try. And now I want, since we're talking about communication, and before we get into tips about being an RPG writer specifically, which is what I was thinking about, I want to continue the philosophical and sort of academic approach here. Rachel, you as my senior in the academic world, as a PhD in person in linguistics, I think this would be a perfect thing for you to comment on.
Meaning
Just all of this. Phil launched into this really interesting philosophical academic study. Like, what does it mean to be a writer, and and the hidden things to it, and the difficulties. And you study language. You study the essence of communication. You study linguistics. This is perfect for you to comment on.
The thing that distinguishes writing from other forms of communication is that no matter what language you are working in, no matter what culture you are from, every person who writes must be taught how to write. No one naturally is able to write. People are, human beings are capable of natural communication. All human beings are capable of that. But every human being who writes must be taught to write. And I'm a linguist, by the way, in case people are wondering. That's what my PhD is in applied linguistics.
Yeah, I just mentioned that.
I know of which I speak, but
literally.
but the thing about writing is that even if you are quote unquote a good writer who has been um, perfecting and practicing their craft for however many years that you've been doing it, there are differences. There are what we call in linguistics discourse communities. So I can be an exceptional writer in one discourse community, meaning, RPG fiction or, even just fiction writing in general, and then even to the extent of, speculative fiction or fantasy, sci-fi, whatever you want to call it. I can be an excellent writer there, but then when I try to make the transition into writing for, and I can even be an excellent academic writer, just in general. But to when it comes to finding your way into a different field or a different genre or a different conversational group or a different discourse community, you kind of have to learn things from the bottom up again. It's sort of like being a new writer all over again. So, when you're, for people who may not be um, very aware of academic writing, for example, or the academic sphere.
It's the
Um,
worst.
when you are an undergraduate, you are an information consumer. So you go to class, you sit in the lecture, you take your notes, you consume the information that your professors give to you, and you usually accept the interpretation of that information that your professors give to you. Um, but they do sometimes encourage you to engage a little bit of critical thought, but for the most part, you're consuming information. At the master's level, you become an information critic. So you're still consuming information, but you're now starting to look at that information with a more critical eye to see, okay, well, all right, I agree with what you said there, or I agree with your method to getting to this conclusion, or nah, that doesn't quite add up, or this has this limitation. And then by the time you get to the PhD level, you are a knowledge creator. You are an information creator. And so the level of cognition, the way you approach writing and communicating that knowledge that you're creating, is something else entirely, and it's not something that you just kind of know how to do. People who get advanced degrees don't just kind of pop out. It's not they're not getting these degrees because they're infinitely smarter than anybody else.
No,
It's just that
no.
they spent the time learning how to do this thing, how to do school, how to do um, what the expectations are. And that's really, for me, if I'm going to give people advice on writing, is know your audience.
Mm-hmm.
Know your
Yeah.
audience.
Yeah, Joe Biden, know your audience.
Because if you don't know your audience, there is no possible way that you are going to succeed at what you're aiming to do. I'm sometimes, I've been struggling with this book that I've been writing for years, and part of it is that I'm trying to figure out which audience I'm writing for,
Mm-hmm.
and I haven't quite figured that out yet. um I'm trying to figure out, okay, is this for a general sci-fi audience? Is this for a more speculative fiction literary audience? Is this for, a feminist audience? Is this for a black audience? Is this for who is this for? I don't even know. So
I
until
can,
I can,
can I vote? Can I vote for the last two? Can
but
I
I
be
mean,
like, because if voting is on the table, I said I vote for black and feminist audience, please. As a
well, I mean,
non-black person, I vote for that.
it's automatically kind of going to be that for that audience, because that's my lived experience. That's who I am, and that's where I come from. But to a certain extent, it's like you kind of have to know who you're writing for and why you're writing it for them. And is this an authentic story? Is this, are you writing to pander or because that's the trendy hot thing right now? Or is it this is a story that needs to be told? I actually have something to say, and this is the best medium for me to say it in. Um, both Phil and I have acting backgrounds,
Even I have a
and
little bit of acting, so I'm sort
theater
of in the club.
background and acting background. So you learn that in theater. See, this is why theater classes are important.
Yes,
Because the things you learn in theater, and this is, and I'm speaking now as a former theater teacher, but the things you learn in theater are so applicable across the board to other things in your life. But one of the critical things that I used to teach in theater and that I learned from my teachers is authenticity. You cannot fake authenticity. I can spot someone who is acting from a mile away, because they're trying too hard. They think they know what I want, and they're trying so hard to give it to me. When if they just get out of their own way and be authentic and be honest and give their best performance as who they are and what they are, and connect with the material from their perspective, they would be giving a great performance that they didn't even realize they had inside of them. And I think acting is, or writing is the same way, is that when you sit down to write something, you have to have a reason to sit down and write that thing. Um, and if you're trying to, if you're saying the hot thing now is Afro punk, so let me write a story with a Black character, and it has to be set somewhere in a place that might be Africa but might not be.
it's set
Never
in
mind the fact
Wakanda.
that Africa's not a country, it's a continent with all kinds of countries and cultures and traditions.
Don't confuse people. Don't come here and confuse people with your facts. Africa is a it's a homogenous. It's a homogenous place. Everyone's the same. Everyone speaks the same language.
They speak African.
They speak
Yeah,
African.
they all speak
That is the
African.
language. They speak
Or they
African.
all speak Wakandan,
Yeah,
but
yeah. They
but
speak. My dream when Black Panther came out was for someone to ask Trump about Wakanda in a press conference, because I am convinced he would have made something up. He would have told, "Oh, it's a real country. Oh, I don't know where that is. Oh, it's great. We're winning."
Agrabah. What are your
Agrabah.
thoughts about Agrabah?
Yes, that would be better. Yeah.
Agrabah is an acronym of Baghdad. I mean, but yeah, exactly what Rochelle just said, and I think this is one of the reasons why so many old writers are feeding their careers into the shredder at this point, because they grew up with a certain perspective and a certain audience and a certain way of communicating, and they have not been paying attention to the way the conversations are going now and the forms of communication now and the things that people are talking about, who's listening, who's talking. They're not paying attention to them. They're still, in 1975, they're still the progressive. They're still the progressive, young gun who's wondering now why people are angry at them on the internet.
Yes,
Harlan Ellison. Harlan Ellison is a perfect example. Or, David Weber, or God, who is it? David Brin.
I thought Harlan Ellison had retired at this point. I was going to say, Biden.
He had.
Yeah.
Well, Biden's a perfect example.
Yes.
Hillary Clinton is a perfect example. Back in my day, guess what? Your day was 40 fucking years ago, and you're not paying attention to what people are saying and concerned about now.
Yeah, exactly. Back in your day, NAFTA wasn't a thing. Please, just gonna say that. But now NAFTA's been a thing for years, and people are wondering where their jobs went, and
that's the one place where Trump is right. Trump is Trump is communicating with where people's heads are at now. We don't like those people. We don't like where their heads are at. But he knows, and he is communicating very effectively to the people who are freaked out by having a black guy representing them.
Well, he did that, but I like just because we're always going to have political tension. I'm sorry, this time it was my fault. Phil was the first. I got Phil last time. Phil was the one who broke last time, but this time it's me. I will take that cross. But Trump did that. But what he also did was that he did sort of the Bernie Sanders move. He started speaking about actual issues to working class people about how their jobs went away. Like, of course, he pandered to all the racists and that, but he also did that, which I think hurt Clinton, because Clinton has had absolutely no credibility. Like, when it came to that, like she couldn't be like, I'm going to stop outsourcing. I'm going to bring jobs back. But he could go and say that because he'd never been in office. So he always had, his supporters could always pull that out. Like, yeah, but he's not been to office. You don't know. So he could play the fake populist. And I think what the last election proved is that in today's climate, a populist is what's needed, regardless of what direction you're coming in from.
Wanted anyway.
And that's what people want. But people want to vote for that, and that's what energizes people. Anyway, so that's an interesting point. This is one of those episodes where I don't really have much to contribute in terms of value. I'm kind of worthless here, like more so than usual. So I'm just fighting to come in with some words, so people are like, oh yeah, that guy's there too.
Well, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to bulldoze over. I want to. This tangent here is underscoring a major controversy in fantasy and science fiction writing right now, which is why can't we just do pure escapism? Why does there always have to be politics?
Oh God,
writing is a political act.
Everything's political.
Everything.
Absolutely
everything.
Everything is political, which is why I hate people who are like, I don't like politics, or politics doesn't interest me. I'm like, fuck you, it is. Is someone backing out?
What now?
What is that?
It sounds like a car. Like,
no, I'm actually in my car. That's why.
Well, Rochelle is always.
It's the only quiet place I can find at the moment. So.
Yeah, that's cool. That's cool. But anyway, so what I was going to say is that if writing is political, singing is political, all art is everything is political, but art specifically is more political than everything, because art is where you could take the social debate and like make it accessible to people. And I mean, and I like to say that Star Wars. Star Wars is, whatever you want to say about Star Wars, be fans of Star Wars. There's one thing I like about the last movies Lucas made, like, episode 1, 2, and 3, is that they were actually pretty good social political commentary. I mean, it was very simplified, but it was actually a very cool examination of how the liberal democracies can be subverted from within and turned into dictatorship pretty much seamlessly. And, and the debilitating effects of having private interests taking over the government and so on. It was actually pretty brilliant in that respect. I mean, it was shoddily written in execution, but what they were going for was very interesting.
Oh, God.
And the reason why I like that is because it's very important to make those debates accessible. Like, I think that's important to do that, because most people can't really talk about like, collateralized debt obligations and why they were bad for the economy before the financial crash and so. But you can reskin it as a fantasy story and make it the economy based on questing and be like, yes, it's collateralized threat obligations. So and so, which someone does in a great series called the Dark Prophet Saga, fantasy and finance in one go. Anyway, that's a plug. Please say what you were going to say, Phil.
You just underscored the difference between good writing and bad writing. As you said, you're absolutely right that George Lucas had a great idea underneath the prequel, but he is a terrible writer. If he had gotten a good writer, which apparently he brought Lawrence Kasdan in to do dialogue polishes, which apparently didn't take or something. But
Vince McMahon did. He changed his mind and was like, no.
Yeah, because Kasdan is actually a very good writer, but you can only do so much, especially if you're only allowed to do so much. But the thing is a good writer could have taken Lucas's points, like with Return of the Jedi, not Return of the Jedi. I hate that movie. Empire Strikes Back, where he had Lawrence Kasdan and Leigh Brackett filtering his ideas, and they turned in a brilliant space opera about that, where there's a lot of emotional complexity, there's a lot of philosophical complexity, especially by 1970s standards, and they took this simplistic space opera and made it into a Shakespearean tragedy, and that's what Lucas was trying to do that in the prequel trilogy. The framework is there, but the skill and the craft and the insight are not there.
He's as many people have said, he's an amazing idea man, but that begins and ends there.
So about Mark Reinhagen.
We don't have heat with him yet. Let's not get the beef yet. But speaking of Mark, all the love. I think he's a lovable guy, but I sometimes it's been weird. Sometimes it's been weird.
Well, Mark is a perfect example, and Mark, if you're listening, I'm not bashing on you here. Mark is a perfect example of what I said a few minutes ago about the person who was right on the cusp of the conversation 30 years ago, who hasn't realized how the conversation changed. And he has always been very, very good with ideas, but he was not particularly good about putting those ideas into words. One of the legacy of the early White Wolf stuff was we had a number of people who were. And so we would get together and we would hash through these things. Mark and Steve and Stuart would come up with these ideas, and then people like Andrew Greenberg, Bill Bridges, Rob Hatch, Jennifer Hartshorn, myself, we would put those ideas, Sam Chupp, although Sam was one of the other people whose work needed to be fixed on a craft standpoint. He had a very good way with words and ideas. He just didn't have a good way with syntax and grammar. And we had a team that could do that. And when parts of that team started to break up, things started to decline. And as Rochelle can attest, being part of that process, at one point I got to the point where in the later days of my first run on Mage, I would hire people for the ideas and then rework the grammar. One of the reasons that Rochelle and I have been tight collaborators for so long is because I don't have to fix yours.
Well, I would hope that the linguists, the cunning linguist in our midst would not have grammar issues. That's good to hear.
Well, Rochelle has talent, a great deal of talent, a great way of putting things into words, a great imagination, a lot of perspective, a lot of insight, and knows the technical, the elements of technical grammar and technical writing well enough that they don't need to be fixed. So thank you, Rochelle.
Yeah, well, thank you for being awesome, Rochelle. That's what we were saying today.
Thanks.
Thank you for being cooler than us. I always find it's weird to self-examine, but I think my strengths, and you could confirm or deny this as you will, Phil. But I'm at least verbally speaking, I can communicate the ideas and sell things. I can go on the stage, give me a microphone, and 2 minutes of preparation, I can go on the stage and I can sell an idea. I can talk about things very well. I am not necessarily the best one to translate that into the written word. I'm a pretty decent writer, I like to think, but I'm a much better idea person and a talker person. That's where my strengths lie, and I think it's important to recognize one's strengths and weaknesses, regardless of
yeah, that's very important.
But of course, not get imposter syndrome in that bitch.
Yeah,
imposter syndrome is just ruining it for everyone. But let's move in. Let's narrow it into RPG writing, because you're both writing novels or have written novels. You've written fiction. The RPG industry. is it worthwhile to get in there? And if it is what would you recommend people to do? Like, what would you guys be like? Okay, you want to write RPGs, and beyond, like, I don't necessarily like, oh, you need an idea and sort of right. Just like, what could you say about being a writer in the RPG world? And I'm totally not taking notes here. I'm not stealing these ideas.
Arg.
Well, okay. So I'm in an interesting situation here now in town in that I have a group of friends who get together and they play game. They game pretty regularly. And this is a group of folks who are LARPers to live action role players for the most part, but they still enjoy tabletop role playing games. And um, recently I went to hang out with them for, I don't know if it was New Year's or no, it was Boxing Day. That's what it was. And they had a party and I was talking to them about things and they were talking about a game and I was like, tell me more about this game that you're playing. And all of a sudden they were like, oh well, no, this is just a thing that we wrote, and these are just ideas that we're testing out. And I was like, no, tell me more about it. And the more they told me about it, I was like, you need to write this down. You you need to write this down. You need to systematize this, and then you need to print this, and you need to start selling this at cons because this is an amazing concept, and it works already because you've been playing it for a year. So you've had an opportunity to kind of work out a lot of the kinks. You've built up the game world. You've built up some strong NPCs for, to kind of drive a meta plot if you want there to be a meta plot. And, for the most part, you have character classes. So it's like, what are you waiting for? Write it. Sit down. Put your butt in a chair. Write that down because that's a brilliant idea. And yes, you can do that. And these are just people who didn't see what they wanted in games that already existed, and so they wrote their own. I mean, one of my favorite novel series right now is the Expanse series by James S.A. Corey, which is written by two authors. And these were two guys that sat down and they created a game world and designed a role playing game and invited some friends over to create characters and play in this universe. And they realized, hey, this game that I'm running right now, this story would make a great novel. And that's what they did. So for people who are thinking about writing role playing games, I think the best advice that I could give is think about the game that you want to be playing. Think about how you want your game mechanics to work. Think about how you want your game world to work. Where is it set? Two good friends of mine here in Atlanta, Milton Davis and Balagun Ojitade, they wanted a role playing game experience where Black people were the heroes, where they were in a land where that was similar enough to the African continent where you could explore the greatness of African civilizations, in a world where colonization didn't exist, and in a world where the enslavement of Black and brown people didn't exist, in a world where these were, the same kind of mighty and powerful nations that enticed Europe to the African continent all those years ago. So they created their own game system, and now they sell it at cons, and it's amazing. It's a great game.
Can we get the name of this game so we can?
It's called Kikanga. So that's KHI and then KHA or KI. Sorry, KI and then KHANGA. So Kikanga. And it is a magnificent game. It is so much fun to play, and particularly for people of color out there, or even if you aren't a person of color, for somebody who wants a game set in a world that's completely different from one you might be familiar with, but that's just as interesting and just as phenomenal and fantastic as, your typical D&D world with, your elves and your orcs and your goblins and all that other stuff.
Sorry, people are expected to play in D&D which is basically just reskinned Norse/British mythology
Right.
stuff.
Yeah.
Let's get some cool new stuff in there instead of having badly redone Norse stuff again.
Right. And there are other people out there who are thinking about role-playing games that are set in other places with other experiences that allow people who look like them and who are from cultures that are similar to theirs to be the heroes and to be the magic users and to be the brave warriors and that I think is really where the future of RPGs is headed. I cannot tell you how thrilling it is to me that we have the Storyteller's Vault.
The Storyteller's Vault is amazing. It has so many cool stuff, and I'm working on stuff to contribute there. Not that I have much of value to contribute, but whatever. Let's pretend I have. And there's so much. I think I agree with you. And I think the future even is now. We see so many great up and coming whippersnappers, if you will, who are writing amazing stuff that's not boring white people stuff. Again, like we see it with like Elizabeth. I can't pronounce her last name, so I won't try. Of Angry Hamster, she's writing Afterlife, wrote a game called Witch. Awesome stuff. Bluebeard Bride is an amazing concept. I've only skimmed the surface of that one. Eloy LaSanta is an African American guy. He has a studio called Third Eye Games, makes awesome, cool games. He's doing a sci-fi Afro futuristic game called Orun, which is
Oh yeah, I love Eloy. He's awesome.
Eloy is one of my many victims. My victims have been people I've nagged into being sort of involved with. I play tested his game Part-Time Gods, which is my favorite RPG, with Mage probably in second place or first. Those two are the fighting ones, and so on. And I think actually that's why I like Mage and Changeling the most out of all the World Like This games, because it kind of was an early thing for that. Because Changeling, in a lot of ways, is an allegory for not neurodivergent people and LGBTQ people, and same with Mage. Like it's like in Mage, like most of the game, the traditional heroes are not rich white people for the most part. They're usually weird subculture people and minority groups and so on, and it's awesome. I mean, also the people who read it were right and thought that Mage for some reason was a libertarian document. We talked about that last time. That was a thing. I could hear Phil's bafflement just like
I know.
hitting me.
This is you can't see me making this face, but I'm making a face like, where did that come from? Wait, what?
That's certainly an interpretation. I mean, really, that's like going in and reading Werewolf and being like, yeah, the alt-right are the heroes in this book. I mean, Pentex has its own version of Fox News. And Pentex
Of course it does.
And Pentex is pretty much the bad guys. I didn't know I had to say that, but yeah, Pentex are bad people who do bad things and save the planet. That's another important message. Phil, are you still here with us?
Hello, Phil.
Phil! No!
I think we lost him.
I think we lost him again. I will see if we can. We will have to see if we can contact him again. But we will keep the show going, and this is not going to be edited out, so we will seem really unprofessional. But whatever. Okay, so we'll keep this going. Topics. Yes, communication, writing. Yes, and I think that it's interesting to me for me to listen to this conversation because I am a mere undergrad. I'm an undergrad student, or a technically done, sort of. I'm a mere underground who is a student of the history of ideas. So while I'm not a linguist, I studied the way ideas have shaped and been conversed about, and the way people think about things throughout history. So it's very interesting for me to talk about writing, because that's the primary means where we can look at historical discourse. And that's through the lens of, writing is the premier lens for which we can absorb ideas and see what people thought at different times. And it's an interesting thing, because
Can you hear me? Can you hear me now?
Yes, Phil,
Yeah.
you're back.
Phil is back.
Yeah,
Yay.
it was something. I was typing something to someone, and some key got hit the wrong way and screwed up the connection. But but you can hear me now.
We can hear you now.
Yes.
And none of this is going to be edited, so everyone will know.
The joys of technology.
It's big.
Hooray!
Usually, when young people like me get older, actually relevant people into the podcasting world, they actually are tech savvy and can do editing and stuff, and they usually piggyback on that way. Not me. I have no technical skills. I have computer one. I can Google stuff and play games, and that's it. I can sort of record this too, but this is very basic. So I think that there's a kinship here with me and Phil. We're both technological neophytes. I like to think that. Phil?
Yes.
Yeah, as you're here. Yes, we can hear you, but I was terrified, so that's why I checked.
So I wanted to go back a little bit to what you were saying earlier, because Avery Alder is a great example of what. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Just because there'd been a anyway. But Avery with Buried Without Ceremony Studios, a perfect example, because she had gone online. I'm guessing it's probably about 10 years, might even be 15 at this point, and was just going, I have these ideas, and they're very simple and they're very quick and easy ideas, and I'm just going to put them up here and see if people like them. And of course, one of them was Monster Hearts, which I think is one of the hallmarks of one of the hallmarks of the new of the new wave of independent gaming. And
I haven't read that yet.
Oh God, you totally.
I have it on my computer. I have the PDFs, but I haven't read it yet.
You should absolutely read that. And the thing is Avery is a decent craftsperson. The writing is not poetic, but it's serviceable. But the ideas behind it really needed to be said, and Avery has done a very good job of doing that.
Could you explain? Sorry for interrupting you. Could you explain Monster Heart for potential listeners? Just short.
The short version would be Buffy meets Twilight, but lots more queer.
So not homophobic Twilight. This is a new.
Not homophobic Twilight. Well, I mean Avery's trans, but it is what Avery was going for. To go back to what you were saying a few minutes ago about the White Wolf started, originally. Part of the appeal of the World of Darkness was playing the other, and that appealed to and came from a lot of people who were other, in terms of the creators. People, I wouldn't even say it's forgotten. People just don't know that one of the co-creators of Vampire is a queer Jewish guy. But people lost that in that was 6 or 7 developers ago. So, but
well, and something else about about White Wolf games, as somebody who kind of came into them, just after they launched. I had come up playing D&D and GURPS and those kinds of systems, which were very, very they were very male centric. Just in terms of, this is something that's for boys, which I was like, really? Why? This is fun. But the way that books were written, the ways that characters were determined, all of these things were it was very, it seemed like there was more time spent tallying up points for this and points for that and points for this and all this other thing, and as opposed to telling the story. And that's what I was always there for
Yeah.
in tabletop role playing games, was I was there for the story.
Yeah. True
And
point.
the thing that was magical, literally magical, about White Wolf Games at the time, and the reason why it became as big as it did, was because for the first time, here was a gaming company that said, meh, yeah, roll some dice if you feel you need to roll some dice, but we're here for the story. And this is how you tell a good story, and this is how you craft good characters, and this is how. And we even had a joke at one point. It's like, the whole, it got to the point where people were so excited about the fact that they could create characters of depth that they would stop at the White Wolf booth and they would tell you about their character.
Yes,
and
they
and
would.
and you and you had to have a signal to the other people at the booth to tell you,
Get
please
me out of
rescue
here.
me,
Yeah.
because this person is here telling me about their character, and I don't know how to get out of this conversation. And it was literally a thing, because people were so excited, about something that now in RPGs we take this for granted, that you're going to create a character that has depth, that has a backstory, that has things in their past that a storyteller or a DM could bring up, and we have this concept of downtime, that in between games there's still inter-character stuff and development that you can do that might affect what happens at the table the next time you sit down to play. I mean, when back in 94, 96, this was brand new territory for a lot of
I,
people. And so
as someone who
I feel like,
as someone who,
go
sorry,
ahead.
so as someone who was born in '96,
Yeah.
I can
Fuck, we're
share.
old. Fuck, we're
You're
old.
so cute.
I can share a bit of perspective on someone who came about when having, because I started playing World of Darkness. I never had a D&D period, but I watched some videos on a video series called Counter Monkey, which was a YouTube thing where a guy talked about role playing stuff. Pretty good, but it's painted such a different picture of role playing back in the day compared to what it is now, or compared to what it is with After World of Darkness and all the other games. Because like people at the D&D group could be like, "Hey, elf, go and get that stuff," because they didn't bother to learn the character's name. And I was just like, "Oh yeah, he's an elf, isn't it? Oh yeah, elf, you go there." After like 10 sessions into the game and so on. I'm like, and that's so weird to someone who has played World of Darkness, where what really matters has never been loot or points or whatever. It's about what's that character and who are they and what's their story. And I mean, the literally the GM, quote unquote, or DM or whatever, is called the storyteller. Is a storyteller in World of Darkness games, and I think that's the right term to use for that role at the gaming table. But that's just a fundamental difference in, instead of being the dungeon master or the game master, it's a storyteller. And that must have been been a huge paradigm shift, was what I was going to get to. But to
Well,
me,
and something people don't, I think that the other thing that was unique about, and that is still unique about White Wolf Games, and that has really changed the way that people play games, of that nature, is the fact that instead, in D&D, for example, very often the DM has a module that either they've
ah,
gotten from somewhere else or they've written themselves. So, because I've had DMs who wrote their own modules. But the fact is that they have something that where the action is largely scripted. it's pre-scripted. Your characters may deviate occasionally, but you can usually bring them back into where they're supposed to go and what they're supposed to see and who they're supposed to meet and the things they're supposed to pick up. And it's all, so you're basically, I'm the one, they are literally the one who is guiding the players through the story. But what happens in games that are the kind of storyteller model of games is, yes, the person guiding the story is called the storyteller, but really you're co-creating story.
Yeah.
All the players around the table are co-creators of story. There have been times when I have planned events or things for a group of players, and a player character has done something that is just so inspired, or asked a question or tried something that is just so creative and inspired, that I'm like, you know what? I'm going to follow this and see where this rabbit hole goes and see what I can do with this and how can I play around with that. And what ultimately ends up happening is that, yes, you have a person who is technically designated as the storyteller, but every single character, every single person sitting at that table playing a character in that game is co-creating that story. And that's a very different way of managing gameplay.
It is.
That just didn't, again, this kind of play, people may have been doing this independently themselves, but in terms of a mass produced commercial game, that just hadn't been done before. And I looking at the games that have come out of that have come out since the birth of the original White Wolf games, and the evolution of the White Wolf games, you can kind of see how that model of gameplay and shared creation of a story has kind of influenced even Dungeons and Dragons and games like that, it's themselves. The Pathfinder games, for example, the richness that exists in the Pathfinder universe is simply astounding. I mean, you can go for years playing Pathfinder games and never really explore the entire game world that they've created, because it is so rich, it is so vast, it is filled with so much depth. There are so many opportunities for stories. And yes, they have modules if that's your thing, but you can also do a storyteller type game in the Pathfinder universe, and that's entirely a possibility. And for me, that really shows the influence of the storyteller style game upon the rest of the industry. And that's not a small thing.
That's not a small thing. And call me a snob, but I sort of, let's call it, growing up as a gamer with or I even use that term, but as someone who engages in role-playing games, a role player, if you will, I only really played storyteller style or storyteller inspired style games. So to me, I'm kind of just like, the concept of a pre-scripted module is kind of, I won't say disgusting, but it almost is. I'm like, no.
There are benefits to it.
Oh, I'm sure there is. I'm not saying they're objectively wrong or anything, that there's no value to them. But to me, it's such a, since I've never played that style. Like, I've never been like I remember the one time I've tried to run or talk about doing something D&D Pathfinders, and people were talking about, you have to balance the challenge rating of this adventure. I'm like, what?
But what now?
Yeah, like never, probably never. But I don't balance things like in terms of when I run games. I watch things happen, and I'm there, and that's really it. Like, beyond that, I let characters run around and do their thing. I don't get involved. In that sense, I'm not like, okay, let's set up a challenge for this adventure. I'm like, oh well, they pissed off the dragon now. I didn't see that coming. Okay, how will they fix this one? That's more my thing. I improvise. I write the setting, but that's where it begins and ends. I just improvise everything. I have some vague concepts of plans in my head, but I never really plan. I just like, because you can't. Especially in storytelling, but in games in general, people will always do something you would never expect. Like, you could send in, like, oh yeah, send in some characters to help the players, and suddenly one of them, before they come in the door, were like, I will throw a flask of acid at their face, and I hit the king in the face with acid. And I'm like, oh well, that's the entire campaign changed, because I've seen what happens to people who get acid thrown on them. That's, yeah. Anyway, sorry for taking a steering conversation along, but we are trying to be educational here, and I think we educate. But okay, so let's say that despite all of the good advice to not get involved with RPG writing, you've decided to do this anyway, and you feel confident enough that you can take a pencil, or rather type something out. How should you do this? Should you do it with yourself and some friends and self-publish, or is it better to try and get corporate, going corporate, join Onyx Path or whatever, freelance? What do you guys think is the best path now? And of course, there's not some people will excel at different things, but try to in what you think in general is a better idea, if you, despite all good advice, have decided to do this.
Well, like everything, the traditional ways of the traditional ways of publishing, the traditional ways of doing a lot of things actually have been so disrupted by the online experience and the boom in technology, to the point where it used to be the only way you could produce a role-playing game was to go through a major publisher, or start small and do freelance for Wizards of the Coast, or try at some point to start up your scrape together enough money to start up your own company and attempt it there. But now there's so many options for self-publishing. There's so many ways to get your work in front of people's eyeballs, and ways that are not hard either. If you have friends on Facebook, or if you have friends on Twitter, and you are trying to launch a new thing, all you have to do is get your friends to start sharing stuff with their friends, and getting their friends to share stuff with their friends, to the point where you've built a large enough pool of eyeballs and people who might be interested in something that you're doing, to the point where, if it catches on enough, you're going to get the attention of people in the industry who have the power and the clout to actually get your work in front of people who can then bring it to more fruition than just, here's this little side hobby that I have that maybe I wrote this thing and it might be pretty decent. Like I look at, I don't know if you know who, he's an entertainer. His name is Randy Rainbow.
Oh yeah.
And this is a guy who has a clever talent for satire. He loves musical theater. He has a talent for satire, and he started putting together little YouTube videos. He just produced his own little YouTube videos of parodies of current political things. And he creates these different characters, and he'd film himself. It started as, like, he would film himself as an interviewer for a famous person, usually a politician, and they were hilarious. And they started out as just this little hobby that he did because he liked doing it and he thought it was fun. And now he's doing stage shows, and he has people like Lin-Manuel Miranda, the creator of Hamilton, saying how much of a genius he is for these, and he's got sold out shows, all from hey, maybe I'll put my little video on YouTube and maybe people will like it. And that has happened to so many people. Um,
Mhm.
and I think the same is true with anybody who is writing. Um, you know, my friend Mur Lafferty, I don't know if you know who Mur is, but she is a phenomenal writer. And started, she got her name out there and really started building a base of popularity by putting chapters of her early novels out as podcasts, as early podcasts. She'd put them online, and every week she would drop a chapter and people would come to the website and they'd read it. And that's how she was able to build her fan base and eventually get to the point where she got, novel contracts from mainstream publishers. So, I say to people, if you have an idea, find a way to get some eyeballs on it. And if it's good, those people will share it with other people, and those other people will share it with other people, to the point where eventually you might have something that launches you into a professional career. And if you don't, well, at the very least, you're still creating and you're still getting your stuff out there. And if that makes you happy, then hey, go with that.
Mhm.
Well, Phil,
Yeah.
you have heard this very, very interesting point. What do you have to say in response to my
Well,
question and what my Rochelle said?
well, Rochelle is right. My thought is, and my experience in this is, doing a little bit of both is helpful, because on one hand, like Rochelle said, and I absolutely recommend, because I did this with you, Carl, recommend people taking the route that Avery and Milton and Balugam and um, Randy and so forth did, of getting the work out there. One of the things that helps with working with a more established company is that it helps you polish your craft.
Yeah.
I know that my craft has been polished considerably by working basically in boot camp. The early days of White Wolf were essentially boot camp, at the rate of words that we had to produce and get out there. Without We didn't have time to think about it. We didn't have time to ponder it, and to go after draft after draft after draft of it. It had to be written and it had to get out there. Uh, and also, something that comes from my theater background is one, a thick skin,
Yeah.
and an openness to criticism. And so when I was working at White Wolf, when we were still actually on the same studio, instead of, like now, in the virtual office, going after my books went to Rob Hatch or Brian Campbell or Cynthia Summers or Kerry Goff, or Ed Hall, going to them and going, okay, how can I do it better next time? And sitting down with them with the red lines and seeing where I'd made mistakes, or seeing places where they suggested that I could be better, and going, okay, I see that mistake. I won't do that again. I see where this could be better. I can do that again. A lot of what I know about the craft came from sitting down with my editors, who had most of them, if not all of them, had gone to school specifically for editing training. And they taught me stylistic things. They taught me content things. They taught me consistency things and grammatical things that I would not have learned anywhere else. That is remarkably helpful training. And the downside of self-producing things is that unless you have the training, you don't know how to be better, and you don't have anybody else holding you to that. And so a lot of self-published stuff, this is especially true on Kindle, but a lot of self-published stuff gets out there, and it's awesome that people are doing it, but it's got spelling errors, grammatical errors, structural errors, uh, yeah, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, that reflect the inexperience of the people. And this is true even, actually, this is true of a lot of the self-published RPGs I've seen, where there are things where there's a great idea here, or there's a great passion here, but the experience and the expertise and the craft aren't there, and that can detract from that can detract from the effectiveness of what's being done. And fortunately, some people have the ability to quickly put out a second edition. Once they put out the first edition, they go, okay, this is the feedback that I'm getting, and now I'm going to go back and fix this thing with the feedback that I have received. Self-publishing allows you to do that, where if you're doing it for a big company, you're just fired, or your book line gets canceled or something like that. And so for people who are interested in pursuing that, either in role playing or in anything else, learn the craft. I'm going to say more about that here in a moment, but I want to finish this thought first. Learn the craft and surround yourself with work with people, however you encounter them, who can help you legitimately make your work better. And I'm stressing legitimately because a lot of writers groups, in my experience, exist for people exalting their ego at the expense of other people's ego, and it just exists to tear people apart. That's not helpful. What is helpful is craft suggestions. Syntax says this. You may want to go back and look at this. An example here of an online writers group that I was part of. Someone had posted their introduction to their fantasy novel, which was basically a huge info dump, and 3/4 of the information in it was historically wrong. And I don't mean they took liberties with it. I mean they were talking about it was set in, I think, the late 1800s, and there was it's like some, I don't remember the details, but it was stuff like this wasn't invented until 19 something or other. This is, somebody is listening to ragtime. No, ragtime jazz is about 2 decades later than that. They were, and when people, myself included, were going, okay, your research is wrong here. That person, basically threw a rage quit and quit the group. That's not helpful to that person, because they're going to continue to put their work out there with the mistakes, and the readers will tear it apart. But I have also seen in online writers groups people who will just tear shit apart because somebody else wrote it and they didn't. And that's the problem. You want to work with people who can point out how your work can be better, not who will sit there and tell you that your work sucks. Saying this sucks is not helpful. Saying you need to learn syntax so that you can express your ideas more clearly, that's constructive criticism. What I was going to say a moment ago is when I was teaching at the Art Institute, and actually the thing that got me the job teaching at the Art Institute was something that I put into all of my classes, but especially the storytelling classes, was a 6 ways of getting your foot in the door professionally and keeping it there. And the first rule of that was always, proofread your work and make sure that when you get your work to an editor or to your audience, as the case may be, and the editor actually is an editor is your audience, a publisher is your audience. You're trying to sell your work to them. When you get your work to the audience, make sure that your craft is solid.
Right.
Because if your craft is solid, if you don't have spelling errors, if your sentence structure is sound, and I don't mean Oxford English Dictionary, and I'll get into that subsect here in a minute. But your sentence structure is sound, where your syntax is effective, where you are using the right words the right way, you are automatically ahead of 80% of the people who are applying to that, who are submitting to that editor or that publisher. Because I know from being the editor and the publisher who has gotten the stuff, a lot of people don't ever do that step, and that's the most important thing.
Even
and it's small stuff. It's small stuff, like verb tenses. Like don't switch verb tense, don't switch back and forth from present tense to past tense unless there's a systematic reason why you were doing so, that has something to do with the way your story or your section is constructed. Little things like, if you're writing a scene from a character point of view, don't start head popping into everybody else's point of view.
Oh
stick
yeah.
with the character point of view through the duration of a scene, because it's jarring to a reader
Hmm.
to start with a character and then pop over to somebody else's head, and then pop over to somebody else's head, and then pop over to somebody else's head. I mean, there's a difference between being an omniscient narrator, or having an omniscient narrator, for your story, and choosing to narrate a particular scene through the point of view of the character. And if you're going to do it through the point of view of a character, even if you have to go back in a subsequent section and retell that scene or replay that scene from the point of view of another character or another group of characters, then do that. But just something as simple as those two things can make the difference between an editor really loving your work or an editor becoming really frustrated with your work.
Yes.
Yeah, even
Absolutely.
even I can comment to say the validity of this, because I have actually at one point in my life I sent write your all call thing, like, oh, if you want to write product path, you write so and so many pages with system and so on. Even I, who don't know shit, knew that I had to proofread this extensively. And if you're like me, who gets word blind very easily, I get like word blind. Like 2 pages in, which is my biggest weakness as an academic writer, is that I can't proofread myself for shit, because after 2 pages I can't see anything. So then they have friends and leech of them and get them to proofread for you, which is what I did. I
Hmm.
proofread myself, and then I sent it to other people, and they proofread it, and I sent it to more people, and they proofread it even more, and that's what I did, and I managed to cut out a lot of mistakes that way.
Yeah. Well,
It obviously didn't work, but it's the right point, it's the right
technique.
mindset, it's right.
Yeah. Well, to go back to George Lucas, and this was something else that I taught in that class: swallow your ego, and every
Yes. Oh,
writer needs an editor. Fuck you, Anne
every
Rice.
single one.
Yeah,
Oh my
fuck you,
God.
Anne Rice. Every writer needs
Every
an editor,
writer
and they
needs
need
an
to learn
editor.
to listen to the editor. Because one of the primary problems with the Star Wars prequel trilogy, and I use that as an example in my classes, is that one, Lucas believed he could do no wrong, and he was incorrect about that. He had surrounded himself with people who were like, "Oh my God, it's George Lucas." So instead of having Harrison Ford going, "You can write this shit, George, but you can't say it," on set in front of everybody, he had Samuel Jackson going, "Oh God, I'm in a George Lucas movie." Where Samuel Jackson, if he'd been on somebody else's set, said, "What the fuck is this? I'm not going to say that."
Exactly.
Um,
Exactly.
Samuel L. Jackson, one of the most charismatic people in the history of Hollywood, playing a really bland
One of the most
guy.
amazing actors. That's how George Lucas got the worst performances of their careers out of
Out of one of
an
the
A
best
class cast.
casts ever assembled.
Yeah,
Yes,
the,
the,
as
the only two people who kind of excelled in the Star Wars were the guy who played Obi-Wan and
yeah,
the
but
Emperor.
Ewan McGregor, and one because Ewan McGregor is an amazing actor, but part of it is Ewan McGregor was there consistently enough that he actually had something to work with. Because the other
Right.
problem that Lucas, because somebody asked Liam Neeson after I believe it was a British journalist, because the British journalist would be tactless enough to ask this. So it basically asked Liam Neeson, "What the hell happened? How did
Yeah.
you do that performance?" And Liam Neeson was like, "Because George Lucas didn't we George Lucas was so afraid of people leaking the script on the internet," which was valid.
Yeah.
Nobody actually got the script, and there weren't rehearsals. They
Yeah,
would basically get their what they call in theater sides. They would
Sides.
get their
Yeah.
lines, and they would be like, "George, what's happening?" He said, and they're standing in front of a green screen in this costume, and other people, another person's like dressed in green, being a blobby thing, and they're like, "George, what's going on?" And he says, "Just say the line." But George,
But
what's
what's
going on here?
happening in this scene? Yeah.
am I
Just
on
say the
fire?
line. Say the line like this, and
Am
that's
I
why.
on fire? Am I on
Yeah,
fire, or what's going on?
Yeah, and that's why you've got, that's why you've got Samuel Jackson or Liam Neeson or um, Natalie Portman basically reading like they're reading off a cue card. They basically are. They
Yeah.
have no
Yeah.
context for what's going on there. Ewan McGregor was in 3 of the films, so by the second one, he kind of started getting the idea. And thinking a few steps ahead of George Lucas. Everybody else was basically showing up on the set and reading their lines, or being told their lines right before the camera rolled, and then getting stuck in a green screen afterward. But to go back to what I was saying a few minutes ago about, but with the editor, there has to be the editor in question has to know what they're editing.
Yeah.
You can't get a really corporate guy in, for example.
Yeah, well, they have to understand. This is why having a good relationship with an editor who understands you, to have good communication, like Dixie Cochran and I. Um, we understand what the other one is going for, and because Dixie understands what I'm going for and understands the quirks of my writing and the stylistic approach that I use, she's not trying to rewrite my style. She's not trying to rewrite my deliberate style. Years ago at White Wolf, when a new editor who will remain nameless, who had just come out of school. I mean, he just came out of school for editing, so he's young, he's eager, and he got the Bastet tradition, the Bastet tribe book. The Bastet tribe book, a section of it is written in 10 different idioms, and that was deliberate. Stylistically, as I've often said, I write like an actor. So for the 10 different tribes, I got into the head and the mindset and the culture and tried to convey a particular idiom in each one. And he started rewriting it all into Chicago style guidese. So when Ken Cliff, the head of editing and developing, asked this editor, "So how's it going?" He says, "Oh my God, this book is awful. I have to rewrite everything." And he went to me and to Ethan, who was the head of of Werewolf at that point. And he's like, "What's up with this, guys?" And Ethan and I were like, "Oh my God, don't rewrite that. That's intentional." No, we did it that way on purpose. And the new
Yeah.
editor was like, "Oh, you
Oh.
don't want it written like this?" We're like, "No, no. If you have a question, ask." So communication between the editor and the author is absolutely essential too, if it's possible, because the editor needs to know what the author is going for, and the author needs to know when it's not working.
And to follow up on this concept of every writer needs an editor, and find an editor that you can work with. um I recently had just the absolute delightful experience of working with Matthew Dawkins
Ah,
on a vampire book, The Chicago Chronicles. And I I do not play in the werewolf or in the vampire sandbox very often. I've largely within the world of darkness. I've been a mage writer pretty much the entire time. And so I'm coming into an unfamiliar game system, essentially in terms of, the backstory and the mechanics. And I'm writing with people who have been living and breathing vampire for years and years and years, almost as long as I've been living and breathing mage. And what was beautiful about that experience for me is that it was challenging, and I had to rewrite a lot because, I would come to Matthew with something and he'd be like, "This is really good, but I want you to do this." And I'm like, oh, okay, well, I can do that. And largely it was because I'm like, I don't know what you want, so I'm just going to write something. And if it's what you want, I assume you'll tell me. And if it's not what you want, I assume you'll tell me that too. So, and we had a really great, kind of iterative process. And by the end, I floated some really out there ideas to him. And I said, "I'm gonna tell you, this is not your standard vampire fare." And he was like, "That's okay. that's what I want.
Mhm.
And that was, as a writer, to know it's like, okay, you're going to give me my head and let me muck around in your sandbox and screw some things up, or introduce some kind of big things that might not have been there before. And there was a moment when we had written a group of characters, and I said, I don't know how this is going to fly. You're going to have to check with people in, it was a group of characters that was based in, or vaguely based in, the Native American history of the Chicago area, and they were not an actual Native American tribe or confederation, but they were entirely fictional. But still, we wanted to be sensitive to those communities. And he came back to me and he was like, "Yeah, we're not going to use this, and I wanted to tell you why." Before you kind of saw it in print. And I'm like, oh, okay. And that's another thing, is that sometimes once you let something go as a writer, particularly if you're writing for a role playing game or something like that, sometimes you'll write something and you'll hand it off to an editor or a developer. And then when you see the finished product, you might look at it and go, okay, that's not necessarily what I wrote 100%, but I see why it was changed.
Mhm.
And
And I think that as a writer, you kind of have to, if you're going to be in that kind of relationship, you have to understand that you cannot be so in love with the things that you've written that you're going to get all bent out of shape when an editor or a developer turns around and either changes them or you know makes other choices that you might not necessarily have made. So I don't know,
I,
Phil, you can talk more about that.
before he does, I just wanted to unrelated. Because I think we can all agree Dawkins is pretty great. He's pretty great at what he
He
does.
is. He's.
He's like
I would work with him again.
he is that sort. I've seen a little bit of his work like behind the scenes because I've been kickstartering, so I've been able to see some of the developing work of certain books and stuff. And he kind of bridges the gap between the artist and like the purely like corporate developer really well, and like mixes the best of both. I think he does is really good at what he does. I mean, he doesn't like me much because I'm very overly familiar and I talk too much, so I kind of annoyed him. But beyond that, so that's fine. I'm not, but I can still say that he's a pretty swell dude when it comes to making stuff, and he's cool at introducing new things, and really does stuff, mostly stuff that I like in games. So that's I just wanted to give a friendly shout out that look up Matthew Dawkins stuff, people. He writes good stuff. I think we can all agree there to some extent, at least.
Yeah,
Indeed, he does.
he and I had to he and I had to get to know each other. We had a rocky start. In
Oh,
part because when he was basically called in to help me with Gods and Monsters at the point where uh, Raven Coyote had just died, Stuart had died a few months earlier, and I was having a tailspin. Plus, going back to the whole um, training people, I brought in two people one person who had never written professionally before, and one person who had written a lot of stuff and published a lot of stuff, but had not worked with an editor before. And so I
Mm.
was doing a lot of craft training with them, and that was very labor intensive. The results were worth it, but there was a lot of work on their end and on mine. And because things were running late, Rich said, told Eddie and Matthew to get in there and help me. And it took Matthew and I a virtual, because he's in
yeah,
England.
yeah.
But we had to have a video conference before we could work out our communication styles, because his initial perception of where I was coming from and my initial perception of where he was coming from were not working. So we had a video conference, and now we get along fine and work together great. but we had a rockier start
Yeah.
because we have very different approaches to how we do things. And Rochelle, who's worked with both of us, can probably knows what some of those things
Oh,
are.
yes, definitely, yes.
Care to not to offend anyone on here? Care to highlight some of those differences, just so people can know
Well,
the
it's kind of like it's kind of like apples and sushi. If
That's a
I can
great
make that
analogy.
if I can make that that comparison, they're both delicious. And they're both, they're both essentially the same thing, but food. But in one case, Phil's style is very, particularly with his writers, his style is very hands off. His style is very organic. And with Matthew tends to be much more engaged in the actual process of writing with his writers. So, and to be honest, I was actually appreciative of that, because I was writing in kind of this unknown field, and because I was flying some very, very brand new ideas that we didn't know if corporate was going to even like. So, um,
secret, if you will.
yeah, so for example, in writing the Mage Cookbook, I was happy to have Phil there as the developer on that project because I needed somebody who would just leave me alone and let me percolate and let this thing happen the way that it was going to happen, and somebody who would be very accommodating to not only my schedule but also the fact that I was like, okay, I'm kind of stuck and I don't know what I'm doing here, but it needs to percolate a little bit more, give me a little bit more time. As opposed to Matthew, who was very, very strict on deadlines and was like, okay, I need this here and I need this here. And if you couldn't make your deadline, he would actually pull other writers in and say, hey, we're all a team of writers. Let's support this person. And I actually got some great support from my fellow writers and was able to support other writers in that same process and on that same book, because of the way Matthew used that sort of integrative, very hands-on developer style. Um, and like again, it's like comparing apples and sushi because they're both very good,
They're both raw
but
food.
it's just a different approach to managing people, to managing the material, and the entire process of getting a book written and to the editors and eventually out to the fans.
Mhm. Thank you, because it's really good to hear. It's really good to hear what that's like from the other side of
Right,
working with me, because I know what I cultivate, but I don't know how it comes across.
right.
And
And
I
of course,
tend
I've been writing with Phil for, gosh, 20 some odd years. So I think part of that too is at this point I'm very much used to him and he's used to how I write. And I think he leaves me alone because he knows that whatever I turn into him is not going to require a whole lot of reworking and re-editing and massaging and whatnot. I think it part of it too is that trust that he and I have
Mhm.
built together over the years, as opposed to, I was a brand new writer working with Matthew only on the recommendation of Phil, who had recommended me to him for that book. So, for all he knows, he's like, well, I don't know this writer, so let me keep in close contact with this writer, as opposed to, oh yeah, I've worked with her before. I don't really need to worry.
I
Um,
mean, Phil, I
so
once.
there, those kinds of relationships get formed, and it does color from a writer's perspective. It does color the way that an editor or a developer comes across in that sort of relationship.
Well, I mean, yeah, but that pretty much sums up. To be a good writer, you need the right editor.
Mhm.
That is a
Very much so.
you
Very
need
much
to
so.
you need the right editor at the right time, which can vary.
Mhm.
And that's the thing. I mean, Phil, I sometimes I think I wrote some stuff to you back in the day. Back in the day, I mean last year, and you didn't call me a dumb fuck. So I feel pretty happy. It was the whole like Kekomancy thing. I was
Oh yeah, okay, the
yeah.
technomancy thing. Yeah.
I
Uh,
wrote some ideas, and you didn't call me a dumb fuck. So I was like, okay,
no,
I'm
I,
pretty
I, I
safe here.
no, I ran with it. I mean, I rewrote it, but I ran with it.
Oh, yeah,
And
and you ran with it, but you didn't take, but you had to cut a lot of the things because there was like a lot of minutia that couldn't fit into the big titan of a book that is Book of the Fallen coming out at some point.
at some point, yeah, and I ended up having to cut all that stuff out anyway because because that book was running over word count and over schedule and over budget. I will be putting technomancy stuff into Fallen Companions whenever the hell I end up finishing that book.
Yeah,
But talking about the Storyteller's Vault, uh, the Storyteller's Vault is a really good place, I think, and I've recommended it to a number of people who either have experience writing the World of Darkness, have experience writing the World of Darkness. So I'm going to be doing it, and at the same time, or who want to get started with something new because it has a foundation, it has a built-in audience, and it has a fan base that, for better and worse, will tell you what they think of it.
Oh yeah,
And
and
yeah.
they will tell you.
that
They will tell you in ways you couldn't imagine.
yeah, that is part of, and this is something else that goes with the advice for aspiring writers. Um, on one hand, you need a thick skin. I mean, you need a thick skin to do and to pursue any creative endeavor, especially in the internet age,
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
this is an axiom which actually came out of something that I said when Ed Hall first took over as Wraith developer, when Rich Dansky handed Wraith over to Ed so that Rich could work on Dark Ages. People started just destroying Ed online, and he's like, "Why are they saying this shit about me? I haven't even they haven't even seen what I'm doing yet." And I said, I told him, I said, when you do something extraordinary, no matter what it is or how well you do it, there are going to be the people who worship you for doing it because you did it and they didn't, and there are the people who are going to throw shit at you because you did it and they didn't. And the trick to this game, whether it's writing or game design or whatever, but the trick to it is to make sure the first group doesn't go to your head and the second group isn't right. After that, do what
Yeah.
you got to do.
I,
Uh,
and
because the people who let it go to their head are like George Lucas, who are like, I am the great George Lucas, I know what I'm doing, and he clearly fucking didn't in the case of the prequel trilogy. And the people who and yeah, and making sure that the people who are criticizing you are not right, um, or at least you don't mean them to be right, is an important element of self analysis. When somebody trashes one of my books, as someone did on Drive Through RPG, with "this is total garbage" and the SJW turned up to 30, I'm like, good, that's exactly what I wanted. I wanted to
Yeah.
piss off the people who said that. But if somebody else says yes, but um oh shit, which the size entry is missing, I'm like, fuck.
I was wondering about that, and I didn't.
that that's actually, talk about Matthew, to talk about the rough transition that we had there. um I was about halfway through uh the the rules chapter in Gods and Monsters, when just things were falling apart, and Rich is like, hand off part of the book. So I handed part of it off to Eddie and Matthew and said, okay, here's the foundation, here are the things, here are the books where the person has to go and they have to look these things up. But every stat that I left unwritten has already got an analog in another book. Go rewrite them based on this. And unfortunately, in the course of all the handoff, because first it was handed off to Eddie, Eddie handed it off to Matthew, Matthew handed it off to Josh. In the court, and I didn't look at it because I was concentrating on finishing the rest of the book. What I didn't realize, what none of us realized until the book had gone to press, was that there was an entry that I had put for the size trait on the chart for the traits, but I hadn't made an entry saying size entry goes here. Matthew and Eddie had missed that there was this one entry among, several dozen, and Josh, because they didn't tell him write a size entry, didn't write it. And none of us noticed that during the proofread pass. Hell, even when it went to the backers, people didn't realize that, because if they had, I'd have fixed it.
I did, but I didn't
nobody said anything till after the book went to press.
I know.
First time one of my books has needed a published errata since 1994, and I was fucking pissed about it. But there were a lot of circumstances surrounding that, and it was a case where there were too many people involved in trying to do too much too quickly, which was
many cooks in the kitchen.
Yeah, and one of my arguments when a book is running late or something like that is, when you rush it, you fuck it up. And with the internet, with the instant feedback from the internet, if you fuck up, people will notice.
People will tell you and notice.
Yeah, they will pounce on you. I mean, they will pounce on shit that people did decades ago. People are still talking about the Gypsy book.
God, I'm so tired of that one.
Gypsy's book.
So tired of that one. Oh my fucking God. I'm so tired of hearing about that, because people and
I mean, we talked about it like 4 times on the show. It's a context issue. And people don't realize that things were different back in the 90s compared to now. I mean, things were different.
Why didn't they check in with Roma? Because social media didn't exist. You couldn't go on to a Facebook group and go, can somebody look this over? This is what we do now. But in 1994, the tools didn't exist.
Yeah. I mean, like, my plan for whenever I'm going to write something of my own that's not like a storyteller's thing, I want to kind of write like modern fantasy, but with like Sami people stuff, because I'm partially Sami and I know Sami people, and I can research that because I know Sami people, and I will have and I have research material and stuff, and I can go on the social medias and message people and find numbers and so. That's an option. If I lived in the United States and I'm like, okay, Sami people, they're a cool ethnic group, we should write about them. How do we do that?
Well, and this is going back to the tools of or going back to the topic rather of advice for writers. Keep current with the conversations and use the tools that you have available to you, because at this point, well, now that the tools are available, a writer has the responsibility to use them. This is something a lot of people don't talk about with art and writing in general, or writing in particular, art in general, is, I believe, as someone who has been a professional artist for over 40 years, the artist does have a responsibility. The artist does not have the responsibility to have to conform to all of these rules, because obviously art is frequently about breaking the rules. But the artist has a responsibility. This is true both in a more well. Hang on, because this is. It is true in both an ethical sense of responsibility and in terms and a structural standpoint of the responsibility to knowing what the rules are before you break them, because this goes back to craft. Knowing what the structure is supposed to be allows you to decide which way to break which rules and why you are breaking them. If you don't know what the rules are, or if in the case of certain edgelords that we have discussed on other things, you decide you just want to break the rules because fuck rules, then you end up alienating the people you wanted to be your audience, because you didn't understand which rules you were breaking. It is both ethically and craft-wise important for an artist to know what the rules are, so that you know which rules you are breaking for what reasons and which ones you intend to break, because otherwise your message is broken along with the rules.
And yeah, that's all very correct. I actually had a big argument with someone about like the need for people. Like, I think you have a certain level of responsibility, especially when you deal with other cultures, to portray them at least semi-accurately, even if it's a fantasy version. Like in Changeling, for example, you have a responsibility to portray folklore creatures sort of accurately, even if it's through the lens of the dreaming and everything. It's a kind of a duty that you have when you're doing this. And I had a big argument about that, but I wanted to get back to the thick skin thing, because I as an aspiring person, I meant writer, but let's say I'm also an aspiring person. I've not proven my personhood yet. But anyway, as I used to think for years that I had really thick skin, okay, that I could take criticism. I'm fine with that. But then but then I realized I don't really have thick skin. I'm like I have foreskin instead. Like I remember shits people said about me years from ago, and I'm still like, someone called me an unfunny dickwad, and I'm still grumbling about it. And that's that's why, to an extent, I can sort of admire horrible douchebags and monsters like Assad in Syria. Like, people have been saying bad things about him on Twitter for years now. And he's still trucking on, like, not giving one fuck, and it's horrible, but I sort of admire that. But it's also made me realize that, like, ignoring the moral part, I don't have what it takes to be a dictator or an ethnic cleanser. I don't have what it takes for that, because I wouldn't handle the criticism, if anything.
Yeah, well, we see what happens with Trump when you.
Yeah, but he can't handle criticism either, because he whines about it constantly.
Right.
At least other dictators are like stoically silent about it in public.
And that's why they have torture chambers.
Yeah, exactly. They get there. I mean, they get back at people. They gas them to death or whatever. But they do it quietly, which I had a class in classical mythology. Classical mythology is a really bad name, but Greek mythology, because classical is it's really posh. I'm a classic student partially, so I'm kind of backstabbing my own field, but really it's posh white people studies. We're like, oh yes, the Greeks and Romans, because people in Norway, we are totally the inheritors of that. Like, that's what the West is about. Western civilization is a totally non-random constructed concept and all. Anyway, that sound right there. That's the classical studies sound. That's the level of like posh entitlement you're dealing with here. But we're talking about the Odyssey, and how like in Odyssey, like Odysseus, like he meets the Cyclops guy, and he's like, oh, I am no one, and then he blinds him, and then as he boats away, boating is totally a word now. He's like, oh, it's me, Odysseus. I am not no one. And we're talking about it. Yeah, fuck you. We're talking about in class, and people are like, would you have not done that yourself if you were in his place? And some people are like, nah, I wouldn't have done that. But I'm like, I have to be honest. I would. If I was in his place, like, not with hindsight, but I would. Even with hindsight, I would have done it, because I'm such an egomaniac prick, and that comes part with I have to take credit for stuff and be like, yes, it was me. It was me all along. And that's I think is also a mistake with me as a writer. I have too much of an ego, I think. I'm not selling myself well here, am I? But okay. I'm being called. I will fix that in a second. Please talk in the meantime.
Well, gentlemen, this has been fun, but I have got to go. So I'm going to have to say goodbye. Alas.
And that's actually an excellent point to cut it off then. We're really professional here.
I need to go as well.
This is actually an excellent point to do it, because I have to do stuff and you all have to do stuff. And let's pretend that I edited out that slip there and we all laugh on this anecdote here. And I hope people who hear this got something out of it. I certainly did. I will shamelessly steal this for my own purposes and probably fail.
Or sharing.
Sharing, yeah, but let me have this. I will pretend to be a horrific parasitic thief. But anyway, hopefully I will write something at some point, and it will not suck too much. But anyway, I thank both of my wonderful guests for being here again. Hopefully, we will be again back here soon. I've called out Hiromi Koda to be the next victim.
Cool.
I call guest.
Excellent.
Do we have, before we leave, do any of you have any plugs you want to get in before we run off?
Rochelle?
Well, I know that the Chicago by Night Kickstarter, the books are going to be shipped soon in print. So if you haven't checked that out on Drive Through RPG, please do. Also, please check out the Mage 20 cookbook. Victor Kinzer and I and Phil and a couple other folks really put a lot of heart and soul and work into that cookbook, and there are some truly delicious recipes in there, as well as some really interesting story elements that you won't want to miss. So check that out.
Ooh.
Thank you. And I will second that endorsement. It's a number of people have been like, "Oh, it's just a cookbook." Like, no, there's so much more to it. You really need to read this book. And one of the reasons it needs to be read is because Rochelle did such an awesome job with the framing narrative in there. So on top of there being these cool recipes, there's just a really neat bit of meta plot running through it that Rochelle wrote really beautifully. And it's also have a kind of a last collaboration between me and Coyote Ward, because the Coyote Cannibal Stew entry in there was something that she and I had literally whipped up together through internet conversation when we were putting that book together. I just want to endorse Gods and Monsters, because I think despite the missing stat, which is going to go into that's going to be in the Technocracy Reloaded in the last section of that, having an errata, damn it. But aside from that bit there, I'm really pleased with the book. And I think that we had a number of really good people, including some folks who had not only their first Mage publication, but in some cases their first professional publication, which Hiromi among them. And I'm really pleased with the way that book came out. And so thank you both. Thank you, Carl, for having us. Thank you, Rochelle, for joining us. Always a delight talking with you both. And thank you everybody who
indeed.
And I have a final plug for myself. I will start doing a solo sort of podcasting thing. I call it the ramblings of a mediocre history student. And I will basically talk about, half of it will be talking about real history, and half of it will be linking it to Mage, so I can justify putting out hard here and using the Mage Facebook group to advertise. That's
excellent.
Clever and kind of lazy marketing on my end. Anyway, thank everyone for being here, and hopefully we will be back soon again.